The morning Hugh Thatcher rode into Caldwell, Kansas, the sky looked the color of old bruises, and he had every intention of taking a woman's home before noon. He had not slept well. He rarely did any more, not since the war had carved its initials into the backs of his eyelids and left them there permanently. He had learned to function on 4 hours and black coffee, to move through the world like a man who expected very little from it and was rarely surprised. He was 31 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with the kind of quiet that people often mistook for coldness. It was not coldness. It was something closer to grief that had been left out too long and hardened into habit. The town of Caldwell in the year 1878 was a cattle town in the truest sense, sitting just north of the Cherokee Strip on the Kansas Indian Territory border, a place where drovers and merchants and gamblers and lawmen all existed in a state of uneasy negotiation with one another. The streets were wide enough for cattle drives and smelled of dust and manure and horses. There were 2 saloons, a general store, a land office, a small church with a crooked steeple, and a sheriff who had held his position for 11 years by the simple virtue of being willing to shoot first when the situation called for it. Hugh had ridden in from Wichita, where he kept a modest office above a hat shop. He was not a gunslinger. He was not a bounty hunter. He was, technically speaking, a debt collector, which in this part of Kansas in this era was not entirely different from being a gunslinger in practice, though Hugh preferred to conduct his business through paperwork rather than pistols. He had a leather satchel across his saddle that contained promissory notes, land deeds, contracts, and correspondence that would make a lawyer weep with envy. He was meticulous. He was fair. He was, by the standards of his profession, considered almost decent. The debt he had come to collect was substantial. $47.30, plus accumulated interest over 2 years, which brought the total to $62.15. In 1878, $62 was not a small thing. It was the kind of money that could sustain a modest family for several months, or purchase a good horse, or keep the lights burning in a failing enterprise for a little while longer. The debt had been incurred by a man named James Bailey, who had borrowed the money from Hugh's employer, a man in Wichita named Gerald Morse, who ran a loan operation out of the back of a hardware store with all the warmth of a December blizzard. James Bailey, Hugh had learned from his paperwork, had died 4 months ago. Pneumonia. He had been 53 years old, a widower, and he had left behind a daughter. The daughter's name was Eva Bailey. She was 22 years old, and she lived alone on the 6-acre plot her father had homesteaded outside the eastern edge of Caldwell, where she kept a small vegetable garden, 3 goats, a milk cow named Bess, and a determination to stay on that land that people in town described variously as admirable or foolish, depending on their own relationship with stubbornness. Hugh knew all of this because he was thorough. He did his research before every collection. It had saved him from awkward surprises more than once. What he had not anticipated, what no amount of paperwork could have prepared him for, was the sight of Eva Bailey's farm as he came around the bend in the wagon road east of town. The farmhouse was small, whitewashed wood that had weathered to a pale silver gray, with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front, and a climbing rose bush on the left side that had grown so enthusiastically it had nearly swallowed the porch railing whole. The garden was extraordinary. Even in the dry heat of early summer, even in this unforgiving Kansas terrain, the garden beside the house was lush and disciplined, laid out in careful rows that spoke of someone who understood the land and had made a conscious covenant with it. There were tomatoes and squash and green beans and sweet corn. There were sunflowers along the fence line, blazing yellow against the brown prairie. There was an herb patch near the well that Hugh could smell faintly even from 100 yards out, some combination of lavender and something sharper he could not name. It was the most alive-looking place he had seen in months. He reined his horse, a gray roan named Biscuit, to a slower walk and told himself this did not change anything. A debt was a debt. It did not become less real because the property it was attached to happened to be beautiful. Eva Bailey was on the porch when he came through the gate. She was not sitting prettily waiting for callers. She was kneeling on the porch boards with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, repairing what appeared to be a broken slat in the railing, hammer in hand, and a row of nails held between her lips like a particularly practical decoration. Her hair was dark and slightly disordered from the work, escaping in tendrils from the braid she had wrestled it into that morning. Her dress was practical calico, faded blue, and there was a smear of wood stain on her left forearm. She looked up when she heard the horse. She did not look afraid. She looked assessing, the way a woman living alone learned to look at unexpected riders, calculating distance and intent and risk in the span of a breath. She took the nails out of her mouth and stood, brushing sawdust off her knees with a kind of unhurried dignity. Hugh pulled Biscuit to a stop at the porch steps. He removed his hat. It was a reflex, not a calculation. "Miss Bailey," he said. She regarded him with eyes that were a clear, unusual shade between hazel and green, the color of creek water in late afternoon. "I don't know you," she said. It was not hostile, it was simply accurate. "No, ma'am, my name is Hugh Thatcher. I ride for Gerald Morse out of Wichita." He reached into his satchel and produced the relevant document. "I've come about your father's account." Something moved behind her eyes, not fear exactly. More like recognition, the look of someone who had been waiting for a particular conversation and was not entirely surprised it had arrived. "The debt," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the paper he was holding, then back at his face, and then she did something unexpected. She set down her hammer on the porch railing, wiped her hands on her apron and said, "You've had a long ride. I have coffee on the stove. Come up and sit down before you tell me how bad it is." Hugh sat with the paper in his hand for a moment, unsure he had heard correctly. In his experience, people did not invite debt collectors to sit down and share coffee. They either argued or wept or occasionally threatened. They did not extend hospitality. He dismounted, tied Biscuit to the porch post, and walked up the steps. And somewhere between the base of those 3 wooden steps and the top of them, something shifted in the machinery of Hugh Thatcher's chest that he could not immediately identify or name. He came to collect a debt. He was already, though he did not yet know it, forgetting how. The coffee was strong and good, served in plain white mugs without ceremony. Eva Bailey sat across from him at a small table just inside the front door, which she had left open so the morning air could move through. The interior of the house was spare but not unhappy. There were curtains on the windows that someone had embroidered, probably her mother, he guessed, from the faded quality of the thread. There was a shelf of books, genuinely surprising in a homestead this modest. There was a framed photograph of a man with a beard and kind eyes that could only be her father. She did not look at the photograph. She looked at Hugh. "How much?" she asked. $62.15, he said, "with the interest accrued." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father never mentioned the interest when he described the loan to me. It was in the contract." "I believe you." He was not always careful about the fine print. There was something in her voice that was not bitterness exactly, more like a complicated love that had had to make its peace with certain facts. "I have $17 saved. I've been meaning to write to Mr. Morse, but I wasn't sure of the address, and then the cow was sick and the garden needed tending." She paused. "I am not making excuses. I am explaining." "You don't need to explain to me," Hugh said, and was immediately unsure why he had said it. She looked at him with that clear, assessing gaze. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Someone louder," she said simply. "Men who come to collect things are usually louder." He turned his mug in his hands. Through the open door he could see the garden, the sunflowers moving slightly in the warm Kansas wind, and Biscuit at the post pulling contentedly at the grass near the steps. "I have a legal obligation to inform you that, in the absence of full payment, Mr. Morse has the right to place a lien against the property described in the original contract," he said, reciting the words he had said dozens of times before. "That property being the homestead currently, this house," she said quietly. Yes, she nodded very slowly. My father built this house with his own hands, he and my mother. She died when I was 11. He stayed. She glanced finally at the photograph briefly and then back to her coffee. He stayed on this land because she loved it. And when he died, I stayed because he loved it. Her voice was even. It cost her something to keep it even, he could tell, but she was doing it with remarkable self-possession for a 22-year-old woman sitting across from the man who had come to potentially take her home. Hugh looked down at the document in his hand. Gerald Morse's signature at the bottom, florid and self-satisfied, the way Gerald Morse did everything. He thought about Gerald Morse, who had never built anything with his hands, who had never stayed anywhere for love of anything except money, who had sent Hugh out here on a 4-hour ride to collect $62 from a woman whose father had died of pneumonia 4 months ago, and who had been trying to save up to pay it back on $17. He folded the document. He put it back in the satchel. He looked at Eva Bailey, who was watching him with those creekwater eyes, and he said, "Miss Bailey, how long have you been managing this property alone?" She blinked, slightly caught off guard by the question. "Since February, 4 months. And you've kept the garden, the animals, the house, all by yourself." "I have a neighbor, Mr. Prout, who helps with the heavier work when he can spare the time, but mostly yes." Hugh stood up. He set his mug down on the table with a careful click, the way a man sets something down when he is thinking very precisely. He walked to the open door and stood looking out at the garden and the sunflowers and the wide Kansas sky, which had shifted from bruised purple to a clearer, harder blue while they had been talking. He had a number of very logical, professional thoughts. He thought about his obligation to Gerald Morse. He thought about the contract, which was legal and binding. He thought about the $35 fee he would receive for a successful collection. He thought about all of this carefully and thoroughly, and then he turned around. "The debt is forgiven," he said. Eva Bailey stared at him. "I beg your pardon," she said. "The debt, $62.15 plus interest. I'm marking it satisfied." He opened the satchel, took out the document again, and wrote across it in his careful, precise hand, "Debt forgiven in full. H. Thatcher." 14 June 1878. He set it on the table in front of her. "That's your copy. Keep it somewhere dry." She was on her feet now, and she was not a small woman, he noticed. She stood straight and met his eyes directly, and right now she was looking at him with an expression that contained several emotions moving rapidly across one another like weather systems competing for the same sky. "Mr. Thatcher," she said carefully, "you can't just forgive someone else's debt." "Mr. Morse, I'll pay Morse out of my own pocket," Hugh said. "He'll get his $62, he just won't get your house." "Why?" she said. The word was simple and direct and contained all of the real question. He considered lying. He considered a useful half-truth about professional discretion or some policy she would never be able to verify. He did not do either of those things. He looked at her, at the photograph of her father on the wall and the embroidered curtains and the shelf of books and the garden blazing yellow through the open door, and he said, "Because it's the right thing." She sat back down slowly. She picked up the document and read what he had written. She set it down. She pressed her fingers to her lips for a moment, and he realized she was holding back something large, keeping it carefully behind the wall of her composure. "You don't even know me," she said finally, very quietly. "No," he agreed. "But I know enough." There was a long silence. Outside, a mockingbird started up somewhere in the rose bush, running through its repertoire of borrowed songs. Biscuit shifted his weight at the post. The morning continued on, indifferent to the remarkable thing that had just happened at Eva Bailey's kitchen table. "Will you stay for breakfast?" she asked. He had not expected that. He stood there in the doorway, hat in his hand, and he had not expected that at all. "I don't want to be any trouble," he said. "You just gave up $62 on my behalf," Eva Bailey said, and something in her expression had shifted, had opened slightly like a window someone had pushed up an inch to let in air. "The least I can do is cook you an egg." He stayed for breakfast. And then, because of a series of small and accidental events that no one had planned, he stayed considerably longer than that. The first accidental event was Biscuit. When Hugh went out after breakfast to untie his horse and ride back to Caldwell before heading to Wichita, he found that Biscuit had developed a mild but genuine limp, favoring the left foreleg in a way that made a 4-hour ride inadvisable. Hugh crouched and examined the hoof and found a small stone lodged in the frog that had worked itself in at some point during the morning's ride. He could remove it, but the hoof was tender and slightly inflamed. Riding on it would be unkind. Eva Bailey had come out onto the porch with a dish towel in her hands and was watching him with practical concern. "He needs rest," she said. "I know. There's a stall in the barn, nothing fancy, but it's dry and there's fresh straw." She tilted her head. "You're welcome to it, the stall, I mean, for the horse." He looked up at her from where he was crouching beside Biscuit. The morning light was fully up now, and it was doing something generous to her face, catching the warmth in her skin and the glints of copper in her dark hair. He told himself he was noticing this only in the way that any observant person notices the quality of light. "I don't want to impose," he said. "Mr. Thatcher," she said, "you forgave my father's debt before you reached the top of these porch steps. I think we're a little past worrying about imposition." He put Biscuit in the stall. He meant to spend the day quietly in the barn or on the porch, out of her way, giving the horse time to recover. That was not what happened. What happened was that Eva Bailey was in the middle of a project. The project was the repair of the porch railing, which he had interrupted that morning. But the railing was only the most visible part of a larger situation. The house, for all its charm, was showing the strain of 4 months of a woman managing entirely alone. The porch had 2 broken slats besides the railing. The roof of the small chicken coop had a section that had come loose in a spring storm and needed to be re-nailed before the next rain. The garden gate was hanging off one hinge. Hugh noticed all of this the way a man notices things he is constitutionally unable to ignore. He had grown up on a homestead in Missouri before the war, the oldest of 4 brothers, and he had spent his childhood fixing things. The knowledge of how to fix things does not leave a man, even when he has spent 15 years sitting at a desk in Wichita processing other people's financial misfortunes. He was examining the garden gate with professional interest when Eva came around the corner of the house carrying a bucket of water for the goats and stopped short at the sight of him. "What are you doing?" she asked. "The hinge pin is sheared," he said. "Do you have a spare in the barn?" She stared at him. "Are you proposing to fix my gate, Mr. Thatcher? Unless you object." She set down the bucket. "I don't object. I've been meaning to fix it for 3 weeks. I just haven't had the right hardware." She paused. "There's a coffee can of miscellaneous hardware on the shelf beside the barn door. Hinge pins included, I think." There were hinge pins. There were also in that morning's work conversations. Conversations that started as practical exchanges about whether the roofing nails in the barn were long enough for the chicken coop repair, and moved by the natural gravity of 2 people working alongside each other into less practical territory. He learned that she had grown up on this land, that she had attended school in Caldwell until she was 16, that she had taught herself to read more broadly from her father's small collection of books, which included a battered copy of Oliver Twist, a volume of poetry by John Keats, a surveyor's manual, and the complete works of William Shakespeare, which she had read twice through and found alternately baffling and revelatory. He learned that she had 3 close friends in town, that she attended church on Sundays without especially believing everything said there, but finding something in the ritual she was not willing to give up, and that she had once, at the age of 19, considered accepting a proposal from a man named Dennis Hartwell who ran the general store, and had decided against it because she could not imagine spending her life with someone who made her feel, as she put it, like a particularly reasonable business decision. She laughed when she said that last part. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was better than he had anticipated, a real laugh, not decorative, that crinkled the corners of her eyes and involved her whole face. He told her, in exchange, more than he usually told people. He told her about Wichita, which he liked better than he admitted to most people. He told her about Gerald Morse, carefully, without betraying any confidences that mattered, but enough that she understood the shape of the operation he worked for and what it cost him sometimes to be part of it. He did not tell her about the war. That was a story that required more time and more trust, and they were only 4 hours into knowing each other. By noon he had fixed the gate, replaced 3 slats on the porch, and renailed the chicken coop roof. He had also, without quite planning to, eaten lunch at the same small table where he had drunk his morning coffee, a lunch of cornbread, and the first of the season's tomatoes sliced with salt, simple food that tasted extraordinary in the heat of a Kansas June. The afternoon brought a different kind of work. Eva was harvesting the earliest of the green beans, and Hugh, who had nowhere urgently to be until Biscuit was better, found himself moving down the row beside her, doing the work he had done as a boy in Missouri, the careful picking that leaves the plant intact for the next harvest. The rhythm of it was meditative, and they fell into a comfortable silence that was, Hugh thought, one of the rarest things in human interaction, the silence that is not awkward, that contains companionship rather than absence. "Can I ask you something?" Eva said, breaking the silence with a tone that suggested she had been debating whether to. "Yes," he said. "Why are you still here?" She said it without accusation, purely as a genuine question. "You fixed the gate and the porch and the coop. Your horse just needs rest, not watching. You could sit in the barn and be done with it, but you're picking green beans." Hugh considered the honest answer to this question for longer than was probably smooth or confident. "I am not entirely sure," he said finally. She looked at him sideways along the bean row. "That's either very honest or very practiced," she said. "Honest," he said. "I don't know what to do with practiced." She considered this. "I believe you," she said, and went back to picking. Late in the afternoon, when the heat had crested and was beginning its slow retreat, they sat on the porch in the 2 plain wooden chairs that faced west toward Caldwell, and Eva brought out 2 glasses of cold water from the pump, and they watched the light change on the prairie. The grass was golden in the late sun, stretching in great rolling waves toward the horizon, and the sky above it was doing something magnificent in shades of copper and rose that neither of them mentioned directly but both of them watched. "My father used to say that Kansas sunsets were God's apology for Kansas weather," Eva said. Hugh felt something move in his chest, warm and slightly inconvenient. "He sounds like he was a good man." "He was a very good man who made some poor decisions," she said. "The loan being one of them. He borrowed it to repair the roof after the ice storm in '76, and then the next year the corn came in badly, and he never quite caught up." She was quiet for a moment. "He was embarrassed about it. He didn't tell me the full amount until a month before he died." She looked down at her glass. "I think he wanted to clear it himself without worrying me." "He loved you very much," Hugh said, and it was not a thing he would normally say, not a thing he said easily, but it came out naturally because it was obviously true, and she deserved to hear it stated plainly. She looked at him, and there was something naked in her expression for just a moment, the kind of grief that does not perform itself. "Yes," she said. "He did." The evening fell. Hugh had not left. He had at some point simply not left, and Eva had not asked him to, and now the fireflies were beginning their tentative blink and flash in the tall grass beyond the fence, and the stars were coming out over Kansas in that astonishing profusion that city people never quite believed when you described it to them. "There's a spare room," Eva said. "It was my father's. I've cleaned it. If you need to stay the night until Biscuit is better." He should have found lodging in Caldwell. He knew that. He should have walked the horse into town slowly and found a room at the boarding house and left this woman to her property, which was hers now, free and clear, because he had made it so. That was what he should have done. "Thank you," he said. "If it's truly no trouble." "Mr. Thatcher," she said, "if you call me ma'am one more time or ask if something is trouble, I am going to put you and your horse out on the road and you can limp back to Caldwell together." He laughed. It surprised him, the laugh coming up out of him with a force he hadn't prepared for. He realized, sitting there in the warm Kansas dusk, that he had not laughed like that in a very long time. "Hugh," he said. She turned. "You could call me Hugh," he said, "if that's agreeable." A smile moved across her face, not the full generous laugh he had heard earlier, but something quieter and perhaps more significant. "All right, Hugh," she said. "Then you'd better call me Eva." He slept well that night for the first time in longer than he could accurately recall. He spent 4 days at the Bailey farm. On the second day, he rode Biscuit slowly into Caldwell to send a telegram to Gerald Morse's office in Wichita, informing him of the account status. He phrased it carefully: account Bailey resolved, debt satisfied, full amount remittance to follow. He did not enjoy writing it. He had $62.15 of his own money he had saved carefully over 2 years of careful living, and he would send it to Morse in full, and that would be the end of it. He had not told Eva this. He was not sure why. While he was in town, he stopped at the general store for supplies, partly for himself, and partly because he had noticed the Bailey kitchen was running low on several things: flour and salt and lamp oil, and he carried them back tied to Biscuit's saddle without calculating what this said about his intentions. The man behind the general store counter was, he discovered, the Dennis Hartwell who had proposed to Eva at 19 and been declined. He was a stocky, pleasant-faced man of about 30 who showed no obvious lingering distress about the rejection, but who did note Hugh's supplies with a particular interest. "You staying out at the Bailey place?" he asked, not unkindly. "Passing through," Hugh said, which was accurate as far as it went. Dennis Hartwell nodded slowly in the way of a man who has lived in a small town long enough to understand that passing through and passing through are sometimes very different things. On the second day's evening, Eva read to him from the Shakespeare, which was not what Hugh had expected, but which turned out to be one of the more unusual and delightful experiences of his adult life. She read well, with an understanding of the language that surprised him, though given the evidence of how carefully she had built her life on this farm, it probably should not have. She read from As You Like It, which he did not know well, and she laughed at the parts that were funny with a frankness that made the warm room feel warmer. He told her that evening about the war. A little. Not all of it, but the shape of it. The young man who had gone in at 18 and come out at 22, not quite the same shape he had started. She listened without offering him comfort he had not asked for, without the awkward condolences or the changing of the subject that people usually did. She just listened, and when he was done she said, "That explains the quiet." "The quiet," he said. "You're the quietest man I've ever met," she said. "Not cold, just like you've got a lot of room inside you that you've learned to live in by yourself." No one had ever said anything like that to him before. He sat with it for a moment, turning it over, feeling the accuracy of it. "That's a fair description," he said. "I recognize it," she said simply. "I've had to learn some of that myself." Since February. On the third day, an event occurred that was less comfortable than green beans or Shakespeare. It arrived in the form of a man named Carson Webb, who rode up to the farm in the mid-morning with the easy confidence of someone who believed himself to be expected. He was a broad-shouldered man of about 40 with a smile that had been designed to do things it did not always deliver on. He wore good clothes for the territory and a hat that cost more than it needed to. Eva came out onto the porch at the sound of hooves, and something in her posture changed in a way that Hugh noticed from where he was working on the fence at the far end of the garden. Not fear, not pleasure, more like the controlled stillness of someone putting their guard up. Hugh walked back toward the house with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has no particular claim on the proceedings but who is paying attention. Carson Webb had dismounted and was on the porch steps, hat in hand, smiling at Eva with a smile that might have been charming if it had reached all the way to his eyes. "Morning, Miss Bailey. Beautiful day." "Mr. Webb," Eva said. "I heard you might be in some financial difficulty," Webb said, with a kind of theatrical sympathy. "About your father's debt. I wanted to come by personally and let you know that my offer still stands. The whole property for a fair price. I know it's not easy, but the debt is settled, Eva said. Webb blinked. I beg your pardon. Mr. Morse's account has been satisfied, Eva said. The property is clear. Hugh had reached the bottom of the porch steps by now. Webb noticed him with the sharp recognition of a man who is used to taking inventory of who is present in any given situation. His eyes moved over Hugh with a quick calculation. And who are you? Hugh Thatcher, Hugh said, easily, leaning one hand on the porch post. I'm the one who settled it. A beat of silence. Webb's smile underwent a small adjustment. Is that so? He said, and it was not quite a question. It is, Eva said, and there was a finality in her voice that was not rude but was entirely unmistakable. Carson Webb stood there for another moment, doing the calculations of a man who has made a plan and is now being required to revise it. He looked at Eva, then at Hugh, and then he put his hat back on and said pleasantly, "Well, I'm glad it worked out, Miss Bailey. You let me know if you ever do decide to sell." He rode away without undue drama. Eva watched him go from the porch, and Hugh stood at the bottom of the steps watching him go from the yard. When the sound of hooves had faded, Eva said, "He has been after this land for 2 years. He owns the land to the north and the east, and he'd like mine to connect them." "I gathered," Hugh said. She looked down at him from the porch, and there was something in her expression that was new, something that had not been there in quite this form before. "You didn't have to come over," she said. "I was just walking back from the fence," he said. "Yes," she said. "You were." They looked at each other for a moment in the warm morning, with the sunflowers moving in the wind and the mockingbird doing its borrowed symphonies in the rose bush, and something passed between them in that look that was less comfortable than green beans and Shakespeare and more necessary. On the third evening, they walked after supper. It was a thing that had suggested itself naturally, the way things do when two people have been moving around each other all day in the contained space of a small farm, and the evening air offers room. They walked the fence line of the property as the stars came out, not talking much, just walking in that rare silence that is not absence but companionship. "You'll go back to Wichita," Eva said. It was not a question, but it was not quite a statement either. It was one of those sentences that is really a door left slightly open. "I will," Hugh said. "I have work there, a lease on an office." He paused. "Though I've been thinking lately that the work I have is not necessarily the work I want to keep doing." She glanced at him in the dark. "What would you rather be doing?" He thought about it honestly. "Something that doesn't involve taking things from people," he said. "Something that involves building instead." He stopped walking. They had reached the far corner of the fence, where one of Eva's sunflowers had seated itself outside the garden proper and was growing up through the fence rails with a kind of inspired stubbornness. He looked at it for a moment. "I have some savings, not a great deal, but some. I've thought about land." "In Kansas?" she said. "Possibly," he said, and did not look at her when he said it, which was either restraint or cowardice, and he was not sure which. She did not press him on it. She just walked back beside him along the fence in the warm dark, and when the coyotes started their distant chorus from the south, she was not startled, only looked out toward the sound with a quiet attention, as though listening for something in it. That night he lay in her father's spare room and looked at the ceiling and told himself a number of very reasonable things. He had known this woman for 3 days. He had a life, such as it was, in Wichita. He had been in this business long enough to know that the romantic notion of a woman on a farm in Kansas was not the same as the reality of what two people's lives actually looked like when they tried to fit together. He was 31 and had made a habit of not attaching himself to things. He was sensible. He was practical. He was the kind of man who carried organized paperwork in a satchel. He was also, he acknowledged to the ceiling of James Bailey's spare room, absolutely certain that he was falling in love with Eva Bailey, and that it had probably started somewhere around the moment she had taken those nails out of her mouth and looked at him with those creekwater eyes on the porch and said, simply, "I don't know you." On the fourth morning, he came to breakfast and found Eva at the stove, and there was a set to her shoulders that he recognized as the posture of someone who has made a decision. He sat down at the table with a slight wariness, the way you sit down when you are not sure what is about to be said. She set a plate of eggs and cornbread in front of him, and then sat across from him with her own coffee and looked at him directly. "Are you going to tell me that you paid Morse out of your own pocket?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "How did you know?" "Because you telegraphed from Caldwell and came back with supplies, and you have not once mentioned being reimbursed or settling accounts or anything a man does when he has successfully completed a professional collection," she said. "You're meticulous, Hugh. I've noticed. You're the kind of man who accounts for things. If Morse had paid you back, you would have mentioned it the way you mention things that are resolved." "You haven't mentioned it." He set down his fork. "It was my decision to make," he said. "It was $62, she said. "Yes. That is not a small amount of money." "No," he agreed, "it is not." She looked at him with that expression that contained multiple simultaneous weather systems. "Why did you do that?" she said. "The real reason, not because it was right. The real reason." The morning light was coming through the embroidered curtains in diagonal bars that fell across the table between them, and outside the mockingbird was running through its borrowed catalog of songs, and Hugh Thatcher, who had spent 15 years being careful and precise and professionally uninvested, said, "Because the first time I looked at this farm I thought it was the most alive-looking place I had seen in years, and that seemed to me to be worth preserving." Eva was very still. "And," he said, because he had started and there was no dignified retreat from this, "because the woman on the porch with the nails in her mouth looked at me like she was reading the fine print of my character, and I did not want what she found there to be someone who would take her house." Eva Bailey set down her coffee mug very carefully. She looked at her hands for a moment, and then she looked at him. "You should know," she said, "that I am not a woman who is easily moved by grand gestures." "I know," he said. "I don't think what I did was a grand gesture. I think it was the only thing that made sense at the time." "No," she said quietly, "it was a grand gesture, Hugh. You just don't know it because you did it privately and without an audience." She paused. "That's actually what makes it grand." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. It was a deliberate thing, not an accident, and she looked down at it and then up at him and did not remove her hand. "I'd like to call on you," he said, "properly, if you're willing. I'll ride out from Wichita or I'll find work in Caldwell. I'm not asking you for anything you don't want to give. I'm asking for the chance to know you better." Eva Bailey, who had been managing this farm alone for 4 months, and had been managing her own life alone for considerably longer than that, looked at the man across her kitchen table. She looked at his quiet face and his careful hands and the deep, inhabited eyes of a person who had learned to live in their own interior space, and she felt something move in her, not a small thing, not the polite flutter of possibility, but something larger and more decisive. The feeling of a door opening onto a view she had not known was there. "You can call on me," she said, "properly." He squeezed her hand once gently and released it. She smiled then, the full real smile, and he thought that it was, in its own way, the best thing he had seen since the sunflowers. Hugh rode back to Wichita the following morning. Biscuit was recovered, moving soundly on the Mendied hoof, and the 4-hour ride through the summer Kansas prairie was the same ride he had made 100 times in various conditions, and yet felt entirely different in both directions than it usually did. He had come out here with a satchel full of paperwork and the stated intention of resolving a financial obligation. He was returning with $62 less than he had started with, and a feeling in his chest that was either hope or the beginning of a significant disruption to his carefully ordered life, and quite possibly both simultaneously. He settled his accounts with Gerald Morse in person, in the cramped back office above the hardware store, and the interaction was as unpleasant as he had anticipated. Morse was a small man in the physical sense who had compensated with an inflated idea of his own importance, and he did not receive the information that Hugh had forgiven the Bailey debt and was remitting payment personally with any grace. "You did what?" Morse said. I paid the debt on her behalf, Hugh said, laying the $62 on Morse's desk in careful bills and coin. The account is cleared. That was not your decision to make, Morse said, going somewhat red about the ears. I have the authority to negotiate settlements, Hugh said. This is a settlement. The account is cleared in full. You'll never collect for me again, Morse said. I know, Hugh said. He picked up his hat from Morse's desk where he had set it while counting out the money. That is, I think, acceptable to both of us. He walked out of Gerald Morse's office and stood on the landing above the hardware store and breathed the Wichita air, which smelled of dust and horses and the river, and felt something that took him a moment to identify. It was lightness, the specific lightness of a man who has set down something heavy that he has been carrying for a long time without quite noticing the weight. He went back to his own office, which was small and tidy and contained his desk, his files, and a window that overlooked the main street, and he sat there for a while doing the arithmetic of his situation. He had lost $62 and his position with Morse's operation. He had his savings, which amounted to a little over $300, and some skills, and a reputation in the territory for being honest and thorough, which was not nothing. He had a lease on this office with 2 months remaining. He had, in Caldwell, a woman he intended to call on properly. He had, he thought, more than he had started the week with in every way that actually mattered. He wrote Eva a letter that evening. He was not a man given to the florid correspondence style of the era, the elaborate paragraphs and rhetorical flourishes, and the letter he wrote was simple and direct. He had settled matters with Morse and would be in Caldwell on Friday week if that was convenient for her. He sealed it and mailed it the next morning, and then he spent the following days putting his affairs in order, which turned out to be less complicated than he had expected because his affairs had always been orderly. He had always been, on some level, a man prepared to leave at short notice. He had simply not known where he was going. Her reply came in 4 days, which was faster than the mail usually moved between Wichita and Caldwell, which meant she had sent it the same day she received his. It said, "Friday week is convenient. I have repaired the porch railing in case you want something to lean against while I read you more Shakespeare. There will also be coffee." Eva B. Hugh Thatcher read that letter 3 times. On the 3rd reading he was smiling, and the woman at the mail counter, who had grown accustomed to his habitually neutral expression over 18 months, noticed it and mentioned it to her husband that evening as one of the day's notable events. He rode to Caldwell on Friday week, and the week after that, and the one after that. By August the town had noticed. In a small cattle town on the Kansas-Indian Territory border, a man who rides from Wichita every week and is seen in church Sunday mornings, and in the general store Saturday afternoons, and at the Bailey farm presumably at other times, is not a man who is simply passing through. Dennis Hartwell mentioned it to the preacher, who mentioned it to the school teacher, who mentioned it to 3 other women, and by the 3rd week of August, the matter of Hugh Thatcher's weekly rides to Caldwell was a thing of general civic knowledge. Eva was aware of this and found it amusing rather than distressing. She told Hugh about it one Saturday afternoon on the porch, and he received the information with the equanimity of a man who has spent enough time in small towns to understand that being noticed is simply the price of existing in them. "Are you embarrassed?" he asked. "Absolutely not," she said. "I just wanted you to know that if you ride out here next Saturday, you are not going to shock anyone." She paused. "And if you don't ride out here, you will deeply disappoint 3 women and the preacher." He did ride out. He brought her wildflowers he had picked from the roadside on the last mile, because he had seen them and thought of her garden's aesthetic and made an impulsive decision, which was not something he usually did, but which seemed to be becoming less unusual. She put them in a jar of water on the kitchen table and did not make a fuss about them, which made them somehow more meaningful. In September he came and stayed 3 days, and they drove together in her father's wagon to a harvest fair in Caldwell, where there were fiddle players and dancing, and the smell of pie from the church lady's table. And Hugh danced with her twice with the honest, unfussy competence of a man who had learned to dance as a young man and had not entirely forgotten how. She danced with her arms lightly in his and looked up at him in the lantern light with the full, uncomplicated attention of a woman who has made up her mind about something and is comfortable with the decision. After the dancing, walking back through the September dark to where they had tied the wagon, he said, "Eva," and she said, "Yes," and he stopped walking. He turned to face her on the dirt road with the fiddle music still audible from the fair and the stars very bright and the warm smell of the late summer prairie all around them, and he said, "I want you to know something." She looked up at him with those creekwater eyes. "All right," she said. "I have been careful my whole life," he said, "about attachments, about letting things matter. I thought it was a reasonable way to live. I'm beginning to think it was mostly just a way to avoid being frightened." He looked at her steadily in the dark. "You frighten me," he said, "in the specific way that things you want very much can frighten you." She was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet the fiddle played something slow and sweet, and the September night held its breath. "You should know," she said, "that I gave up my mother's curtains, the ones in the kitchen." He was briefly confused. "I'm sorry." "When my father died and I was going through his things, I put several of my mother's things in a box in the barn because it was too painful to have them out," she said. "I told myself I would deal with them eventually. 2 days after you left in June, I went to the barn and I brought those curtains back into the house." He understood what she was saying. He understood it completely. She was saying, "Before you came, I was keeping myself very contained and very safe, and after you came, I started letting things back in." She was saying it in her own precise, roundabout, Eva way, which was actually more eloquent than a direct declaration. He reached up and touched her face, his thumb at her cheekbone, gently. "Eva," he said, "don't be careful about this," she said quietly. "I'm not asking you to be reckless. I'm asking you to just let it be what it is." He kissed her then, on the dark road outside Caldwell with the fiddle playing behind them. A kiss that was neither impulsive nor calculated but something in between. Something that had been arriving for 3 months and had finally simply arrived. She kissed him back with the same quality, unhurried, certain, her hand coming up to rest against his chest. When they stepped back from each other, the night was the same night it had been before, and yet the arrangement of everything in it seemed slightly different, the way a room looks different when someone has moved a single significant piece of furniture. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. "All right." They drove back to the farm in the wagon under the stars, talking about small things, the harvest figures from the fair and what she was planning for the fall garden, and whether he had any thoughts about the land listings he had been quietly looking at in the Caldwell area. And by the time they reached the farm, the conversation had worked its way, naturally and without drama, to the question of what Hugh Thatcher was going to do next with his life. He had, he told her, been in contact with a man in Caldwell named Robert Ames who was looking for a partner in a modest land and title business. It was legitimate work, careful work, the kind of work that involved knowing how to read a contract and conduct an honest negotiation, which were skills he had in abundance. Ames was a reasonable man and Caldwell was growing. The cattle trade was bringing money into the territory, and where money went, land followed. It would mean moving to Caldwell, he said. He said it carefully, looking at the road ahead over Biscuit's ears. "Yes," Eva said, "it would. I want to do things in the right order," he said. "I don't want to presume." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Hugh, what order are you thinking about?" He stopped the wagon in front of the farm gate, which swung open smoothly now on its repaired hinge. He turned to look at her in the silver October moonlight, and she was looking back at him with those eyes that always read the fine print, and he thought, "She knows. She knows what I am trying to say, and she is making me say it clearly, which is exactly what she should do. I am thinking," he said, "about the order in which a man asks a woman to marry him and then moves to her town, as opposed to moving to her town and then asking, which seems less honest about intentions." Eva Bailey sat beside him on the wagon seat in the cool October night, with the crickets still singing in the grass beyond the fence and the moonlight on the white farmhouse, and the rose bush a dark shape climbing the porch. And she looked at this quiet, careful, unexpectedly generous man who had ridden out 4 months ago to take something from her and had instead given something back, and she said, "Is that what you're doing, asking me?" "I am," he said. "I don't have a ring. I have 3 months of wages saved from the new arrangement with Ames, or I will have, and I intend to." "Hugh," she said. "Yes. Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes, I should get a ring, or yes, you'll." "Yes," she said again, and she was smiling, and it was the full, real, generous smile. "I will marry you, Hugh Thatcher." He took her hand. He held it in both of his in the moonlit dark, and he was not a man who cried easily, but something in his throat made itself known, and he breathed through it carefully. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I have been sure," she said, "since about the second day. I just needed to know that you were sure." "I have been sure," he said, "since about the first morning." He looked at her. "Since the nails." She laughed the real laugh, and he laughed with her, and Biscuit, who was an opinionated horse, tossed his head as though weighing in. They were married in November, in the small church with the crooked steeple, on a clear cold morning when the sky was the deep blue of a Kansas winter, and the wind came down from the north with serious intent. Eva wore her mother's dress, which had required some alteration, done at the hands of 2 of her friends from town who were fiercely opinionated about the hem. Hugh wore a dark coat he had purchased in Wichita for the occasion and his cleanest hat, and the expression of a man who cannot quite believe his own good fortune, and is attempting to be worthy of it. The preacher, who had been deeply invested in this outcome since August, performed the ceremony with evident satisfaction. Dennis Hartwell shook Hugh's hand afterward with a genuine goodwill that Hugh respected. The church ladies provided a wedding lunch that involved 3 kinds of pie and strong coffee, and a considerable amount of cheerful noise. Robert Ames shook Hugh's hand, and said he was looking forward to the partnership starting on Monday, which Hugh thought was a pleasantly practical note to add to a wedding day. That evening, after the guests had gone and the farm was quiet, they sat on the porch in the November cold, wrapped in a wool blanket Eva had brought out, watching the stars appear over the dark prairie. The rose bush was bare now, its thorny arms reaching up the porch rail in their winter state, but it was clearly alive, clearly waiting, clearly the kind of thing that came back every spring. "Happy?" he asked. She leaned into him, her head against his shoulder. "More than I know how to say," she said. "You." He put his arm around her, drawing her closer against the cold, and looked out over the land that had been her parents' and then her father's and was now theirs. The prairie stretching dark and enormous under the star-filled sky, the garden gone dormant but full of potential for the spring, the fence gate swinging properly on its repaired hinge. "More than I know how to say," he said. The winter was not easy, winters in Kansas rarely being so, but it was the kind of not easy that is made manageable by having a person beside you. Hugh's work with Robert Ames kept him in town most days, and he learned the rhythms of Caldwell the way you learn the rhythms of a place you intend to stay in, the people and their histories, the way the cattle trade moved through in seasons, the particular politics of a border town that sat so close to the Cherokee Strip. He came home in the evenings to the farm and the fire that Eva had going and the smell of supper, and the combination of those things was so precisely what he had not known he was looking for that it still surprised him sometimes, coming through the door to find her at the stove or the table or simply there. She, for her part, had expanded the farm's small operations over the winter, consulting with the Prout family to the west about their root vegetable storage methods, and setting up a more systematic arrangement for the spring planting. She had sold preserves at the Caldwell General Store in December that had been well received, Dennis Hartwell having pronounced her tomato preserves the finest he had stocked, which she reported to Hugh with a dry satisfaction that made him smile. They had disagreements, of course. They were 2 people with strongly formed opinions and the habit of self-sufficiency, And there were occasional mornings when the kitchen felt a little tense and occasional evenings when they had to work at understanding each other's reasoning. But they were fair to each other, consistently. They argued the way honest people argue, with the actual thing rather than the accumulated subtext, and they found their way back to each other with a reliability that Hugh had not entirely expected and was quietly grateful for. In February, exactly a year after James Bailey had died and left his daughter alone on the farm, Eva told Hugh that she was expecting. He was at the kitchen table with his account books when she told him. She sat across from him and said it simply in the direct way she said everything, and he set down his pen and looked at her for a long moment and then got up and came around the table and held her, just held her, his arms around her shoulders, her face against his neck. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said, and her voice was warm against his skin. "A little sick in the mornings, but fine." "Your father," he said, because he was thinking of the photograph on the wall, and she understood. "I know," she said quietly. "I wish he could have known." "I think he would have been pleased," Hugh said. "He would have interrogated you thoroughly," Eva said. "And then he would have been pleased." "I would have answered the interrogation honestly," Hugh said. "I know," she said. "That's why he would have been pleased in the end." The spring came again to the Bailey farm with its reliable insistence, the garden coming back exactly as Eva had arranged it, the rose bush erupting into pink bloom up the porch rail, the sunflowers going in along the fence with a determination that matched their planters. Carson Webb had not come back. His ambitions, Hugh had learned through Ames's office, had redirected themselves toward a different parcel of land to the east, and the Bailey property was no longer part of his calculations, which suited everyone. The partnership with Ames was going well. Hugh had found his footing in the work with a speed that surprised even himself, discovering that the skills he had spent years applying to debt collection, the reading of contracts, the understanding of title chains and property descriptions, the careful negotiation between competing interests, were exactly the skills that made a good land and title agent. He was building a reputation in Caldwell as someone honest and thorough, and in a business built on trust those were the only credentials that ultimately mattered. One afternoon in May, a man came into the office who Hugh recognized, though they had never spoken. He was an older man, 60-something, with the weathered look of someone who had been on the frontier long enough to be part of its original furniture. His name, he said, was Elias Cross, and he had a property dispute with a neighbor over a fence line that had been in contention for 8 years and had cost him, by his reckoning, 3 good crops and 2 lawyers. Hugh spent 4 hours with Elias Cross that day, going through the original land survey documents and the subsequent deed transfers. And he found, in the patient way that you find things when you are looking carefully rather than quickly, that the confusion had originated in a transcription error in the original 1869 survey. He wrote a letter to the county land office in Wichita. The fence line was officially clarified. Elias Cross shook his hand with a grip that nearly rearranged his bones. 8 years, the old man said. 8 years, and it took you 1 afternoon. It took someone looking for it without a stake in the outcome, Hugh said honestly. That's all. Elias Cross told everyone he knew about Hugh Thatcher's land office, and the business grew through the summer in a way that required a second desk and a part-time clerk. In August, the 3rd August since Hugh had ridden up to the Bailey farm with a debt document in his hand, Eva gave birth to a boy. A solid, emphatically present boy who arrived in the pre-dawn hours of a warm August morning, attended by the doctor from Caldwell and Eva's friend Clara, who was the steadiest person Hugh had ever met, and who tolerated his presence in the corridor with a patience that he was grateful for. He heard his son before he saw him, the fierce, indignant announcement of a new person who has arrived in an unexpectedly bright world and has opinions about it. The doctor opened the bedroom door and Hugh came in, and there was Eva, exhausted and beautiful in the morning light coming through the window, with a small red furious person in her arms. He sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at his wife and his son. He had not known this was possible, this specific feeling, the sense of the world having expanded to include something you could not have imagined the dimensions of until you were standing inside it. "He's here," Eva said. Her voice was the voice of a person who has done an enormous thing and knows it. "He's here," Hugh agreed. "What do you think?" she said. "I think," Hugh said carefully, "that he looks like someone who is going to have strong opinions." "He comes by it honestly," Eva said, and smiled the full, real smile from the pillow. They named him James for her father, with the middle name William, which had been Hugh's father's name, dead now 10 years. James William Thatcher, who by all early evidence did indeed have strong opinions, primarily about sleeping and eating, and the general adequacy of the world's attention to his requirements. The farm was full in a way it had not been before, not loudly full but occupied, lived in completely, the kind of fullness that comes from a life that has arranged itself around the right people. Hugh had a habit now of coming home in the evenings and going first to wherever James was, which changed as the months went on, from the cradle in the bedroom to the blanket on the kitchen floor to, eventually, the porch, where the boy liked to sit and watch the prairie in the late afternoon with a seriousness that Hugh recognized and Eva found extremely amusing. "He has your face," she told Hugh one evening, watching James regard a beetle on the porch boards with the focused attention of a small scholar. "He has your determination," Hugh said. "He has both, unfortunately for everyone," Eva said, and leaned into Hugh's side in the way she had learned to do, naturally, without thinking about it, the kind of ease that accumulates between two people over time. The years moved in the way that good years do, not slowly, not quickly, but with a sense of being fully inhabited. The land office grew. Caldwell grew, as cattle towns did in the late 1870s and into the 1880s, growing, and then, as the cattle trade shifted with the railroads, changing into something different but continuous. Hugh and Robert Ames navigated those changes with the careful, forward-looking attention of men who understood that a community is not static and who preferred to be part of shaping its evolution rather than resisting it. The farm grew too. Eva had expanded the garden over 3 seasons until it supplied not only their household but a regular arrangement with the Caldwell boarding house, which served her tomatoes and squash and green beans at every table with a pride that the boarding house owner freely attributed to her supplier. She had added 6 more chickens, a second goat, and a plot of winter wheat that she managed with the same systematic intelligence she applied to everything. She was not a woman who sat still. Hugh had known this from the first morning, the hammer in her hand, the nails in her mouth, the broken railing she was repairing when he came. She was always in motion, always building, always finding the next thing that needed attending to. He had learned to match her rhythm, to be someone who moved at her pace without feeling crowded by it, to find in her energy something that complemented rather than exhausted his own natural stillness. In the spring of 1881, when James was nearly 2 and had graduated from regarding beetles with scholarly interest to attempting to consume them, which required closer supervision, Eva told him she was expecting again. This time he was there, at the kitchen table, having supper, and she told him between the main course and the dessert with a tone that suggested she had been waiting for the right moment, and had decided this moment was adequate. He reached across and took her hand, and she smiled at him, and James, oblivious to the significance of the exchange, applied himself to his cornbread with great concentration. This time the process was known to them, which made it both easier and harder in its own way, the waiting having been calibrated by experience. The doctor was familiar, the house was ready, and Clara was available, and on a November morning when the first winter cold had arrived and the rose bush on the porch had been cut back for the season, Eva gave birth to a girl. She was smaller than James had been, and quieter, and she looked at the world in the first moments of her life with the same clear, assessing expression that Hugh had first seen on her mother's face on a June morning 3 years ago on this same porch. He told Eva this, And Eva laughed the real laugh from the pillow, and the sound of it mixed with the daughter's small sounds and the noise of James somewhere in the house being managed by Clara with the iron diplomacy of the experienced. They named her Rose, for the climber on the porch that came back every spring. James, when introduced to his sister with due ceremony, looked at her for a long moment with his father's measuring seriousness, and then patted her hand once, with the gravity of a small person who has decided to approve. He was, after this, her fiercest ally, a habit that stuck with him through childhood and beyond, but that was a story for later years. On the evening of Rose's first week, when both children were sleeping and the farm was quiet in the November dark, Hugh and Eva sat on the porch wrapped in blankets despite the cold, because it was their place, the porch, the place they had been from the beginning, and the cold was not sufficient reason to abandon it. The rose bush was bare and thorned and sleeping, but its roots were deep in the Kansas soil, established and certain, and it would come back in April the way it always did. "Do you ever think about that morning?" Eva asked, "when you rode up?" "Often," he said honestly. "You had the document in your hand," she said. "I could see you'd been traveling. I thought, here is the man my father owed, and he is going to tell me how much trouble I am in." "You offered me coffee," he said. "I had not expected that." "I offered you coffee because you took your hat off," she said. "People who are going to be cruel don't take their hats off. They keep them on as a way of saying they're not staying." She looked at him with the lamp light from the window touching the side of her face. "You took your hat off, and I thought, this one might be decent." "I was trying to be decent," he said. "I'm not sure I had fully decided to be until I was sitting at your table." "That's what decency usually is," she said. "Deciding at the table." He thought about that. About all the tables at which various decisions had been made, or not made, about the morning 4.5 years ago when he had ridden up to this farm with Gerald Morse's document, and ridden away having forgiven a debt he had been sent to collect, and about all the mornings since that had accumulated into the life he was sitting inside of right now, on this porch in this cold, next to this woman. "I told myself I was being practical," he said. "I told myself it was the right thing." "Wasn't it?" "It was both," he said. "It was practical and it was right, and it was also something else that I couldn't have named at the time." She leaned into his shoulder. "What would you have named it?" He thought about it carefully, the way he did most things. "Hope," he said. "I think I was doing the thing you do when you have stopped expecting much from life, and then something arrives that makes you want to try expecting again." He paused. "I think forgiving that debt was the first truly hopeful thing I had done since I was 22 years old." Eva was quiet for a while. The wind moved across the prairie with its low, constant voice, and somewhere in the darkness a coyote made its comment, and the stars over Kansas were doing what they always did, which was everything. "You know what I think," she said. "Tell me." "I think my father would have liked you enormously," she said. "I think he borrowed that money and could not pay it back and felt the shame of it. And I think if he had known that the man who came to collect it would turn out to be you, he would have felt a great deal better about the whole situation." Hugh felt the warmth of that move through him. He thought about James Bailey, the man in the photograph with the kind eyes, the man who had built this house with his hands and stayed on this land for love and borrowed money for a new roof after an ice storm, and had not managed to pay it back before the pneumonia found him. He thought about the debt he had forgiven before he reached the top of the porch steps, or perhaps partway up them, or perhaps even before he dismounted, if he was being precise about it. "I think," Hugh said, "that your father's debt is the best investment I ever made." She laughed against his shoulder, and he held her in the blanket on the porch in the November dark. And inside the house James slept in his small bed with his determined face, and Rose slept in her cradle with her clear eyes closed and her small hands curled. And the farm held them all with the solidity of something that has been built to last. The rose bush would come back in April. It always did. 3 years later, in the spring of 1884, Hugh Thatcher stood in the doorway of the house that had been James Bailey's and looked out at the garden, which Eva had been in since dawn. James, who was now 5 and had developed an opinionated relationship with most aspects of the world, was helping her in the way that a 5-year-old helps, which is to say with great enthusiasm and erratic accuracy. Rose, 2.5, sat at the garden's edge in the grass with the gravity of a small judge watching proceedings. The sunflowers were in along the fence, freshly planted. The rose bush was in full extravagant bloom up the porch rail, pink and overreaching, fragrant in the morning air. The land stretched out in the Kansas spring, greening up after the long winter, the sky the clear hard blue of a day that intends to be beautiful. Hugh had a letter in his hand from Robert Ames, who was expanding the land office into a second location in Wellington, to the north, and who was asking if Hugh wanted a partnership in that expansion too. It was a good offer. It was the kind of thing a man who had started from nothing and built carefully arrived at, the offer that means you have become something real. He thought about who he had been in June of 1878, riding toward this farm with a satchel full of other people's obligations and a life that contained very little of his own. He thought about the man who had removed his hat at the bottom of the porch steps without knowing why, who had folded a legal document and put it back in his satchel, who had fixed a gate hinge because he could not fix it. Eva looked up from the garden and saw him in the doorway. She shaded her eyes against the morning sun. "Are you going to stand there looking thoughtful all morning?" she called. "Or are you going to come help?" James looked up too. "Papa," he said, with the tone of a co-conspirator, "we're planting the beans." Hugh folded the letter from Ames and put it in his coat pocket. He stepped down off the porch and walked across the yard and through the garden gate, which swung smooth and clean on its long-repaired hinge. And he crouched down beside his son and the bean seedlings and looked up at his wife, who was watching him with those creekwater eyes that had been reading the fine print of his character since the morning they met, and finding, he thought, nothing in it she could not accept. "Tell me where you want them," he said. Eva smiled. She pointed. He planted. Rose, from her judicial position at the garden's edge, approved. The spring light moved across the Kansas prairie in long gold sheets, and the farm was alive with it, every growing thing reaching toward the sun with that instinct that needed no justification. And the life that had begun with a forgiven debt on a June morning 6 years ago continued on, rooted and full, in the beautiful ordinary business of being exactly what it was. Later, when the beans were in, and James had reached the approximate saturation point of a 5-year-old's enthusiasm for agricultural labor, they sat on the porch together, all 4 of them, in the way they did on good spring mornings. Eva had brought out coffee for the 2 adults and milk in tin cups for the children, and the rose bush leaned its blooming weight on the repaired railing above them, generous and persistent, exactly as it had always been. James was telling Rose a story about a beetle he had seen, with the narrative expansiveness of a child who has not yet learned that stories need to be shorter. Rose was listening with polite skepticism. The prairie spread out before them in its spring green, and the sunflowers would be blazing yellow in 2 months along the fence, and above them the wide Kansas sky was doing what it had always done, indifferent and magnificent and entirely untroubled by the small but very real happiness assembled on the porch below it. "Ames's offer," Eva said quietly over her coffee. "I'm going to accept it," Hugh said. She nodded, the nod of a woman who has already worked out the logistics in her head while planting beans. "Wellington is 2 hours north," she said. "You'd be home most nights." "Every night I can manage," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. He knew she did. That had been one of the truest things about their life together, the knowing. Not the easy knowing, not the knowing that means you never surprise each other, but the deeper kind, the knowledge of a person's actual character, the way a deed describes a piece of land not by what it looks like on a particular day, but by its permanent and legal dimensions. He had come to know her that way. She had come to know him, and the knowing was not the end of the wanting to know more. It was, if anything, the condition that made more knowing possible. He reached across and took her hand, the way he had at that kitchen table on the fourth morning, the deliberate gesture that was not an accident. She turned her palm up and held his, and they sat like that on the porch in the spring morning, while their children conducted their negotiations about the beetle and the sunflowers blazed yellow in the mind's eye of the future, and the rose bush bloomed above them in its annual, inevitable, undefeated way. The debt had been forgiven before he reached the porch. The life had been built, carefully and together, in all the mornings since. It was, Hugh Thatcher thought, looking at his wife's profile in the spring light, looking at his son's earnest face and his daughter's clear eyes, looking at the garden and the fence and the Kansas sky and the rose bush that came back every April without fail. It was more than he had known to hope for. It was, Eva Bailey Thatcher would have told you, exactly what she had known was possible. Both of them were right.